But over the last 2 years or so for me, since getting involved with this amazing project, I've got to know many of you very closely and personally, and I have emerged from it a more fulfilled individual for that. The event today is very much the culmination to the sense of its end of chapter 1 as far as the Iran Tribunal is concerned. But one of the themes in the next just few minutes I want to warm to is the importance that it is but the end of chapter 1 and not the end of the book. Because it is what the work, the effort and the commitment has produced to date and how it is used that is important. There has been and there will be much debate, and we've no doubt may be dealing with questions about it again today, perfectly legitimately, as to how the parameters for this inquiry were chosen. And I emphasise again, as chair of the steering committee, guided by a wealth of people who you will see later on today, that the choice and the parameters of the inquiry of the Iran Tribunal was of its nature pragmatic, and the attention to detail, particularly in relation to the period of 1988 and around that period, was a pragmatic decision because of the time and the resources and the money available to the project, however generous that has been. It is simply, but importantly, a snapshot of what had been happening in your country, in that country, for many years before and after. And I certainly, as chair of the steering committee, see it as that, a graphic, tragic snapshot, but certainly not the whole picture, nowhere near it. And I say again, as we introduce this final judgment, that it is on that basis we present it, not that in any way the period covered by the judgment is meant to be a period that is neither more nor less important than all the other tragedy that occurred before and after it. It was said to me earlier on today that throughout the 1980s period it was estimated that there was probably one execution per half an hour in the Iranian Republic. One execution every half an hour, which sums up the depth of the tragedy that we scrape the surface on as far as this inquiry is concerned. But during the period that we've examined this matter, estimates of between 10,000, 20,000 people who lost their life really brings the tragedy of this story home. Over the last 2 years, the meetings of the steering committee have helped but guide amazing campaigners, workers, bereaved, victims, and simply people committed to the rule of law and human rights to where we are now. The Truth Commission, copies of this report you'll see are available outside, heard and examined the evidence of a wealth of witnesses, the tragedy of their story which can only be seen by reading those pages, culminating of course in the hearings at The Hague, where the evidence was presented by, I don't include myself in this, but an able team of prosecutors. I think there were certainly Payam and Sir Geoffrey are here today, and others may be as well, and forgive me if I've not seen them. But an able team of prosecutors assisted by amazing research and administrative backup that made The Hague possible. And it is the result of that evidence that we find ourselves here today to have that judgment presented. I'll close at the end of this afternoon by asking what next. And maybe you'll ask what next as well during the question and answer session. But before we even go there, I want to pose a question to the international community. Why did it take you so long even to be aware of the tragedy that was going on in this country at the time? Why did you turn your heads away? And why do you continue to turn your heads away from the tragedy that was occurring in Iran at the period of time that we examine, and around and about that period of time as well? Why is it the United Nations, for instance, a body we are taught to trust and revere, have so ignored this tragedy that was unfolding in that country? If this judgment that you have obtained can do anything, and it will do a wealth of other things, it is to force the international community, the international legal community, the politicians of international nations, to do something about the tragedy that we know of now, and that as a result of this exercise far more people know about. I'd like to introduce to you now Judge Johan Kriegler. He will no doubt have his blushes spared by this brief introduction. I was talking to him outside a moment ago about the art of the advocate, and about all the good advocates need very few notes upon which to remember their lines. Perhaps for this I need a few more notes than normal because of the achievements of Judge Kriegler. A South African human rights lawyer, 25 years at the Johannesburg bar and 10 years on the bench. Judge Kriegler was a founding a member of the new Constitutional Court of South Africa. And every time I say new Constitutional Court, that music usually rings. Appointed by President Mandela in 1994, and Judge Kriegler served there until 2002. But that didn't signal his retirement. His wide-ranging involvement in international affairs included work for the United Nations and the International Bar Association. And no doubt a preliminary review of his passport will indicate countries such as East Timor, Liberia, Libya, Pakistan, Palestine, and Sudan, but just a few countries where this man has worked in the human rights field for the good of mankind. In 2008, he led a 6-month international review of the African Union of Kenya's failed elections in 2007. And more recently, he spent 9 months as an electoral complaints commissioner in Afghanistan. That's just headlines and head notes of Judge Johan Kriegler, who, with a team of other judges, now present their judgment to you. Thank you, Judge Kriegler.
Professor Cooper, ladies and gentlemen, this is indeed the culmination of an important stage, and we trust not the last stage of this particular process. It is a judgment, as you heard from the unduly fulsome CV that Professor Cooper was kind enough to provide. I was a judge for many years. I intend speaking as a member of the tribunal, and therefore as a judge. I intend giving our conclusions, our reasons, and if any questions arise later in a question and answer session, I would be happy to add to that. I want to start this judgment before referring to the actual formal text. It is a truism in jurisprudence that a judgment is only as good as the argument that the bar presented in support or in opposition to the issues that are to be dealt with in the judgment. In this particular instance, the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran was invited to be represented at the hearing in The Hague. It didn't decline, it ignored the invitation, which put an added burden on the team of lawyers who were presenting the evidence to the tribunal to ensure that it was a proper hearing, not the kind of one-sided, cynical and sordid charade that was practiced upon the innocent people of Iran for so many years, and probably, for all we know, still is the practice. They behaved with exemplary professional integrity. They sifted the evidence and they produced a body of cogent, logically interrelated and corroborative evidence. And let me say a word about corroborative and corroboration. It is a term used by lawyers to say that things rhyme with one another. They supplement one another. They go to strengthen one another. Thus, if you have evidence of a witness as to something that happened in Tehran, and then you have some evidence about something that happened in Tabriz, and it has certain corresponding echoes, you say to yourself, this adds to the truth of both stories, because they had not talked to one another, and you have these echoes. Now, that is what our team presented for us, a corroborative body of evidence, initially at the Truth Commission, and then subsequently at the hearing at The Hague, a body of evidence which had the potential to be unreliable. And I, as an experienced jurist, went to The Hague saying to myself, it is a pity that the government of Iran is not represented. I would like to hear the other side. I would like to have the evidence tested in cross-examination or in contradiction. I therefore went to The Hague with a predetermined attitude of, I will listen, and I will listen skeptically. I would keep a healthy skepticism about the evidence, not only because it isn't being tested, but because it dates to decades ago, and it is common experience in trials that witnesses over a period of time rethink and think again and add to, and sometimes pervert what actually happened. The picture becomes more a recollection of what should have happened, or what you think happened, or what others told you, or what others asked you. So I went to The Hague ready to listen with a jaundiced ear and a jaundiced eye. I speak for myself, and I speak for my colleagues. We were totally convinced of the credibility, the substantial truthfulness of the evidence that we heard. Of course, here and there were little additions that were unimportant, but the substance of the evidence that we read that had been adduced at the Truth Commission, and the substance of the evidence that we heard at the hearing in The Hague was totally credible, totally convincing, and if I may add, horrifying. I will deal with it in slightly more detail in a moment. That by way of introduction. The judgment, with its annexures runs to several hundred pages, something of the order of 600 or 700 pages. I assure you, I wish to do no more than give a brief overview of what it was supposed to cover and what it did cover. The judgment, as judgments do, commences with a history. The history starts at the turn of the 19th, 20th century, when a modern constitution with introducing a constitutional democracy of a kind was introduced in Iran. It takes us through 1948, when Iran, as a fully fledged member of the international community, was a party to and approved of and adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and in the 70s was a signatory to and adopted the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, both international covenants that set the standard of what is expected of governments in the modern world. It was a constitutional democracy until the late 70s, in some respects a tainted democracy, but a parliamentary democracy until the revolution and in the adoption in November 1979 of the new constitution and the formation of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The history thereafter is a sad reflection on that constitution. The constitution contains a number of the standard guarantees expected of a constitution. It guarantees the right of assembly, it guarantees the right to due process of law, in other words, a fair trial right. It bans, in absolute terms, the use of torture. Unfortunately, as so often happens, those guarantees were worth more on paper than in reality. The history that unfolded then starts in 1979, 1980, 1981 with the dismantling of the judiciary, the judicial system, the rule of law, such as it was in Iran up to then, and the substitution of a series of amateur courts presided over by untrained presiding officers, usually religiously trained to a certain extent, but judicially wholly untrained. And the fact that the evidence is of sham trials throughout Iran is not surprising in the circumstances. The pattern that then develops from the early 80s through to 1988, which is the period covered by the judgment, is characterized by persecution, massive repression, brutal repression of a whole gamut of minorities in the country. The fundamental denial of the essence of a modern state by the state of Iran, a state in which the right to dissent was denied, and not only denied, but was ruthlessly stamped out. This extended right from the extreme left wing of the political spectrum through the whole spectrum of political minorities. Everybody who was opposed, or more precisely, who was not an enthusiastic supporter of the new theocratic regime, was regarded as an enemy of state, or, as it was said, an enemy of God, and therefore not worthy to live.
It's a model for other organizations to do the same.
I repeat, across the whole spectrum of political points of view, dissentient minorities were persecuted, followed, arrested, and dealt with, as I will describe in a moment. This repression also covered sectarian dissidents. More particularly, it targeted the Baha'i community, which originated in Tehran, or in Iran, which at the time had some 600,000 adherents. It has extended to around the world. It was regarded with particular venom by the regime and was the target of many forms of repression and oppression, which I will also deal with more specifically in a moment. It then also extended to ethnic minorities. There's a significant Arab minority in Iran. I did not know this, and I think many interested and informed members of the world at large do not know of this significant number. They too were the target at times of specifically intended genocide. Mass killings merely because they were Arabs. The Kurds, a significant minority, were no better off. They too were targeted, not because of what they had done, but because of what they were, which is a denial of the basic concept of respect for a human being, and a respect for a human being to have her or his own views, and to have his or her own identity. It's a denial of the dignity and the right to exist of people who differ from one in respect of natural characteristics about which they can do nothing. The very fundamental, most fundamental denial of respect for human beings. And then, of course, a specific target that covered all political views, all ethnic, all sectarian views. The regime was particularly vicious against women. Women who were regarded as chattels, women who, if they dared to be involved in any of these activities that were frowned upon by the state, were singled out for particular cruelty, for particular insults, for particular humiliation. I said earlier that we were horrified by the evidence. While speaking of the treatment of women, I want to single out one particular aspect where women, by some people in the regime, were subjected to a cynical treatment that is virtually incredible, because it was believed that you should not execute virgins because they would still go to paradise. You rape them before you kill them. You rape them either as a simple, unblemished, disguised rape, or you force them into a so-called marriage where the husband will then exercise his marital rights and deflower the virgin so that she can go to her death in a fit state for the state of Iran to deal with her. The treatment went beyond the grave. The second horrific specific instance that I wish to mention, and I wish to mention this because it made an indelible impression on me, and I wanted to make an indelible impression on everybody who hears me today, or anybody who sees what I'm saying and hears what I'm saying on film. The regime at one stage saw fit to shoot its opponents by firing squad and by ordinary shots fired at point blank range. They later took to hanging them in a most cruel fashion, not to break their necks, but to strangle them to death slowly. But those whom they shot, on many occasions when the next of kin, the families came in their grief and in their respect for their dead, and as is proper in the culture of the people, to collect the bodies, to wash them and to bury them, they were made to pay for the bullets that were used by the regime to kill their loved ones before they could take the body. It is a cruelty of a callousness that is incredible. However, the evidence came from many parts of the country at many times, and it is evidence of a kind that simply could not have been invented and have been repeated by so many credible people from so many different communities and different parts of the world. The killings were preceded by torture of a kind that I had never encountered in anything that I had ever read, of a depravity, physical and psychological torture, obliging people to be a party to the firing squad killing their own comrades, obliging people under torture and threat of death to witness the execution of their colleagues, to make them sit and listen to the others being tortured before their turn came, to isolate people in boxes sitting around a crowded room, but each sitting in a little box and being obliged to keep totally silent and communicate with nobody, notwithstanding being surrounded by others. A form of torture for which somebody said it was the coffin, the others called it the cage, that caused a breakdown of one's sense of humanity, one's sense of belonging to people, one's sense of being able to communicate with one's fellow human beings. One of the essential qualities that distinguishes humankind from any other form of life on earth, this capacity to communicate, to be placed with others in torture and in pain and not being able to speak to them for days and weeks on end while you are sitting in the same place. And of course, this all started with sudden disappearances. Sudden disappearances, summary execution of some. When the family goes to find out what has happened to the son or the father who disappeared this morning, they are shown the bloody corpse that afternoon. No trial, no suggestion of a trial, no attempt at fair trial proceedings. Those who in the 1988, after the infamous fatwa, of which I will tell you in a moment, those who were then executed in droves in 1988, prisoners who'd been in prison for years and who had committed no possible crime since their incarceration many years before, were retried and they were brought before mullahs and they were asked, do you still adhere to your such and such faith or ideology or political belief? Do you accept the regime? If the answer was anything other than yes, and sometimes even when the answer was yes, the result was a sentence of death, which was carried out virtually there and then, within a day or two. The bodies were thrown into trucks. We had horrifying evidence of people who heard these weird sounding thuds throughout the night and didn't know what it was until they realized that it was the corpses of their colleagues and friends and brothers that had been hurled like sacks of potatoes into the back of a truck to be taken to burial places where they were dumped in communal graves without any respect, without any notice to their families and their next of kin. a denial of the respect that is due to a human being even when life has disappeared from the physical body. They desecrated the graves of those whose next of kin had found the bodies and put up headstones. The contempt for the persons alive and dead, all in the name of the regime. The trials, I said before, were a cynical charade. The torture, the bastinado where they beat people on their foot soles, bled, restored them again, stopped the beating until the sensitivity had returned, and then started beating them again. I did not know that one's kidneys collapse under those circumstances. On occasions, many occasions, this led to kidney failure and death. On some occasions, we heard of some witnesses who were actually put onto dialysis, kidney dialysis, because they didn't want them to die, they wanted more information from them. The cruelty of using medical treatment in order to restore people, in order to torture them more, is a denial of the humanity of human beings. They denied people their medication. People who came in with medication were denied their medication. The treatment was of a nature that complies with every single tick mark that you make as a lawyer when you wish to decide whether this is a crime against humanity in terms of the nature of the crime. It is of a depravity that is incalculable, and it is a body of misdemeanors against their own people that deny the right to life, the right to dignity, the right to liberty, the right to freedom from torture, the right to a fair trial, the right to being respected as a human being, having your opinions respected. You go through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to which the government of Iran at the time was a participant, or the International Covenant, and you can tick off each one of the fundamental rights, and you say that was desecrated, that was desecrated, that was violated, that was ignored on a widespread basis throughout the country. Now, I say on a widespread basis because a feature that the tribunal had to consider was not only the nature of the crimes, which is one of the elements of crime against humanity, but it has to be of a generalized nature. It has to be systematic. It has to be systemic. You must be able to say it was widespread, and it was as a matter of state policy that these things were done. These weren't individual frolics by sadists on their own initiative. These were acts, these were atrocities committed in the name of and on behalf of and as agents of the state, the Islamic Republic of Iran. So one looks to see how widespread it was, and you look at a map of Iran, which was provided to us, and you see that from the southwest to the northeast, and from the southeast to the northwest, and everywhere where there was a prison of any significance, these crimes, following the same patterns, were committed over a protracted period. And the inference that the tribunal drew is an irresistible inference that these were atrocities committed not by local mischief and violence, but as a tool of state policy. The legal issue that we had to confront, I will deal with very briefly. I don't want to bore you, but I have to deal with it. Today we have a statute passed, adopted in Rome and approved by the United Nations, adopted by the United Nations in 2002, that really sets the standards of what are crimes against humanity today. These acts that we are talking about took place well before that, and the question is, what in the 80s constituted crimes against humanity? We did, and to this, in this respect, I want to pay homage to our colleague John Dugard, who is an international expert on the topic. He analyzed the law dating from the mid-19th century all the way through the end of the 19th century, the Geneva Conventions, the statements relating to the oppression of the Armenians in 1915, the statements at the end of World War I, ultimately the Nuremberg trials, their findings in respect of crimes against humanity, and individual jurisdictions thereafter dealing with Barbie and Eichmann and such like. And we came to the conclusion, on the strength of what Professor Dugard had researched for us, we came to the conclusion that in 2002, Article 7 of the Statute of Rome was a codification. It was a recognition of the law as it already existed at that time. It did not create new law. It recognized that in the family of nations, over more than 100 years, there had evolved a system of norms and standards whereby certain conduct committed in a certain context was recognized as a crime against humanity. Now, the importance of this is this. The international community has evolved and developed to the stage where we feel that no man is an island unto himself, and no state is an island unto itself. What a state does to its own citizens is the business of the international community. It is the business of the family of civilized nations around the world. The norms are the norms that apply to all countries, and there is no basis upon which a government can appeal to revolutionary or theological zeal to justify breaches of the elementary rules of how governments must deal with the people within their jurisdiction. We came to the conclusion that based on the evidence, not only of the nature of the conduct, but in the context in which it took place, the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran during the period covered by our trial committed serious, repeated crimes against humanity. The implications thereof for the international community are to be answered by that community. We say this is phase 1. It is not for this tribunal to say what phase 2 must be, but the tribunal can indeed say that its findings, based on the evidence presented to it, do constitute conduct of a kind that cannot be forgotten, should not be allowed to be forgotten, and should be pursued by all means that civil society and governments universally can find to pursue them. At the very least, if all else fails, those who suffered at the hands of these evil men should know from us, the community at large of decent people in the world, we feel your pain. We understand what happened. and we want those who are still alive in Iran and who have been given places of honor within that state and places of great eminence, those who are guilty of these crimes as individuals, they must know that it will never be forgotten. That is the message of the judgment of the tribunal that I'm honored to present to you. Thank you.